After wishing everyone Shalom Aleichem, we're on Daf Vav, and Daf Vav is a very long shakel v'tarya. We're going to jump in sort of in the middle, but I'll try to fill you in as a review of where we were holding. But just to show you where the place is, so you have your finger on the place. Again, you have different Gemaras in front of you, but I have this classic Gemara. So if you're looking on Daf Vav Amud Aleph, we are about, I would say, 12 lines up before the end of the Amud. You'll see a line that starts v'chitema, and if you zip across that line towards the left, it'll say v'ha tana bi'alma koi. That's where we're up to, v'ha tana bi'alma koi. Now, this comment of the Gemara, again, it's part of a long shakel v'tarya back and forth, is a comment related to the Brisa about Binyan Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos. And the Brisa invokes the pasuk, Eshab Sosai Tishmoru Ani Hashem, Kulchem Chayovim B'chvodi, to justify that Binyan Beis Hamikdash does not override the Shabbos. When it comes to Shabbos, we take a break from the work and the construction of Binyan Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara vacillates back and forth as to what was exactly the case of Binyan Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos. There are two possibilities. We're at a crossroads. One possibility is called Meleches Binyan, which means that by stacking up one stone on top of the other, we violate a Melacha D'Oraisa with the Chiyuv Kares. The other possibility was Lav de Mechamer, and all the supplies and stones that have to be brought to the site on the back of a beast of burden will be a violation of Shabbos, but not as a Malacha and a Chiyuv Kares, but rather as a separate lav of Mechamer. And the Gemara vacillates back and forth. What was a Havamina that Shabbos would be trumped before the mitzvah, by the mitzvah of Binyan Beis Hamikdash? Kamash Malon, no, that's not so. We don't trump the Shabbos. On the contrary, Shabbos trumps the mitzvah of Binyan Beis Hamikdash because of Eshab Tzosai Tishmor. Now, what's at stake over here? When you ask the question, what was the Havamina? It seems like a very theoretical question, but really there's a lot at stake over here, because the assumption is that Eshab Sosai Tishmoru is teaching me not the rule, but in sense the exception to the rule, that Shabbos, because of its tremendous chumrah, in that if you desecrate the Shabbos, you're considered a kofer. If you observe the Shabbos, you're being modeh in the creation of the world. Then Shabbos becomes the exception to the rule, rather than the rule itself. Now, what would have been the rule itself? Well, that depends on the Havamina. If the rule itself would have been, for example, in the case of Mechamer, that essay Docha Losa said, the essay of Mechamer, the essay of Binyan Beis Hamikdash would override the mitzvah, the Losas of Shabbos. In a case of Mechamer, then the implication would be that elsewhere, if not for the Chumrah of Shabbos, we would apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas. And that's fine. But if, on the other hand, we take the other approach, that the Havamina was Meleches Binyan, then if Shabbos is the exception to the rule, then the general rule would be Esei Docha Losas, even in a Losas Sheish Bo Kares. Now, that sounds like bad news, but in truth, that's very good news, because that would justify the pasuk of Oleh in the case of Yibum of Achos Ishto. Because for the last, shall we say, Blat Gemara, we're trying to figure out what was the Havamina that Yibum would trump the Erva and the Chiyuv Kares of Achos Ishto, such that the Torah needed to add the word Oleh to teach me Limute the case of Yibum in Achos Ishto. Was there such a serious Havamina. Now, if the case of Binyan Beis Hamikdash entails a violation of Melechet Shabbos in the case of Melechet Boneh, then, okay, Shabbos we're not going to override because of the Chumrah of Shabbos, but had it been a regular lav, again, a lav sheish bo kares, because we're talking about Binyan, then the essay would have overridden the lav. Hence, I answer my question and justify the need for a leh in the case of Yibum Bachos Ishto. If, on the other hand, what we're talking about here is the lav of Mechamer, and we're no longer dealing with a lav sheish bo kares, but rather a standard lav, then the implication might be that outside of the realm of Chumrei de Shabbos, if we would take another lav, then the rule would be Esei Dochalotase because it's a regular lav. But I would not justify a Havamina that Esei could override a lav sheish bo kares. And now we're up to the Gemara V'hatana B'almakoi. Now, to appreciate Tana B'almakoi, we're going to review one more point that we made last time we got together, which was on Yom Rishon, and that is that there was a Havamina that Kibud Ava Aim would override, and here we have a list of two lavim, the first of which is the lav of Lo Suchal Lis Alim, and the second, so sorry. And the second one was the lav of Tumas Kohanim. So what are the cases? The father says to his son, I don't want you to return an Aveda. Keep it for the family. And that would be a violation of a lav of Lo Suchal Lis Alim. A father says in an alternative scenario to his son, who's a Kohen, I want you to go into the Beis HaKvaros in order to retrieve an object which is free, it's hefker, and violate the Isa Tumas Kohen. And in both these cases, the Brisa invokes the pasuk, Eshabsosai Tishmoru Ani Hashem Kulchem Chayovim B'chvodi. If you are very careful about it, you notice that we're no longer dealing with Shabbos. The whole concept of Chumrei de Shabbos is irrelevant here. We're talking about the lav of Aveda and the lav of Tumas Kohen, and these lavim are not Shabbos lav. So the Gemara says, "Vatana be alma koi." The alma meaning we're no longer dealing with Shabbos and the chumrah of, admitting and conceding that God created the world, or chas v'shalom denying that. Forget about all those chumras. We're dealing with regular, classic, rank and file lavim like Tumas Kohanim or like Hashavas Aveda. And we are invoking the pasuk Eshabsotzai Tishmoru to prove that Kibbut Ava'im and these two lavim would not override and be docha the lavim. And that would prove that the Brisa no longer analyzed the pasuk Eshabsotzai Tishmoru the way we thought it did, namely as establishing Shabbos as the exception to the rule because of the chumrah of Shabbos, but rather Shabbos becomes a classic lav, like any other lav, which is called in the Gemara's language a lav bi'alma, and you would have a havamina that esei docha lo saseh, and the Torah is now telling you Hashem sosei tishmoru kulchem chayovim b'chvodi, that the Torah objects and will not allow overriding a lav, whatever that lav is, forget about Shabbos, for the sake of a kiyuma esed. The Sanya Yochel Omalo, Aviv, Hitame, and his son is a Kohen. Osha Omalo Aviv, his father says to him, Al Tachzir, don't return this Aved to violate the lav of Sukha Salam Yochel Yichmalo, Talmud Lomar, Ish, Imo, the Aviv Tiro, the Eshab Sosei Tishmoru, Ani Hashem, Kulchem chayovim b'chvodi. So Hashabsosai Tishmoru is now presenting the power of the lav such that it cannot be overridden by an essay. And we're using that pasuk, which speaks explicitly about Shabbos, to refer to other lavim, lav di alma. And it teaches that we don't violate the lav of Shabbos for Kibbud Av Ha'em, and we won't violate Tumas Kohanim or Hashavas Aveda for the sake of Kibbud Av. So now we see that the concept that we've been operating with until this point, namely that Shiny Shabbos Dechamiri, is not correct. Shabbos is not to be classified as a lav chamur, but rather as a lav di alma. Otherwise, the drasha and the derivation from Eshabsosei Tishmoru with regard to those other two lavim would make no sense. Oh. Now, if that be the case, then we have the following problem. Let's assume that in the case of Binyan Beis HaMikdash, we're talking about the lav of Mechamer. On Shabbos, we want to carry all the supplies, as we said before, on the back of a beast of burden, and the Torah prohibits that under the pasuk Bim Hemtecha in the Aseret Dibros. And the Torah is now telling me that even for the sake of the mitzvah, the great mitzvah of Binyan Beis HaMikdash, we will not override the lav de Mechamer. Now, if that be the case, then we should derive the conclusion that ein essay dochalos haseh, that the essay of Binyan Beis HaMikdash does not override the lav of Mechamer on Shabbos. Hence, this should become a Binyan Av from which we could derive the conclusion that ein essay dochalos haseh. And our smichos haparshios on Daf Hey, from Lo Silbash Kilayim to Gedilim Taselecha, to teach you that tzitzis overrides Kilayim, is an incorrect derivation, because we now have something more explicit, where in the case of Lav de Mechamer, the Torah says that for the sake of the essay of Binyan Beis HaMikdash, we don't violate the Lav of Mechamer. Oh, you'll tell me, no. Don't derive such a far-reaching conclusion that ein essay dochalos haseh from the case of Mechamer on Shabbos. You'll tell me no. Shabbos is different because of the chumrah of Shabbos. No. Now we see from this brisa that we have to reject that principle, that shiny Shabbos dechamiri. Because if we were to say shiny Shabbos dechamiri, then there would be no justification to derive from the pasuk Eshabsosei Tishmoru that Kibbud Av Ha'em does not, sorry for all the negatives here, it's a couple of negatives here, but we would not be able to justify our derivation from Shabbos that Kibbud Av Ha'em cannot override Tumas Kohanim and Aveda, because Shabsosei Tishmoru Shani Shabbos Techamiri. The answer is that we've proven from the brisa of Shabsosei Tishmoru with regard to Kohanim and Aveda that we view Shabbos as lav di alma. If we view Shabbos as lav di alma, we strip Shabbos of its unique stringencies and we view it as a classic paradigmic lav of any lav in the Torah, then the Torah is now telling me in the pasuk Shabsosei Tishmoru that Kibbud Av Ha'em does not override any lav. Not the lav of Shabbos, not the lav of Tumas Kohanim, not the lav of Hashavas Aveda. If that be the case, we should turn everything upside down and derive the conclusion that ein essay dochalos haseh, that this becomes a binyan av to teach me that an essay does not override a lo taseh. And you no longer have the luxury of applying the svara that we applied in the entire sugya here on Daf Vav of shiny Shabbos techamiri. Because if you're going to tell me shiny Shabbos techamiri, then you have no justification of using this pasuk of Shabbos with regard to the cases of Tumas Kohanim and Hashavas Aveda. So we've now rejected shiny Shabbos Chabiri, and once having done so, we now have a binyan av that an essay cannot be docha or losas. That's where we're holding now in the Shakel Vitar. Now, Rashi adds another important piece to the puzzle. We have another option. Forget about Lav de Mechamer. What is the violation of Shabbos that the Torah is addressing here with the pasuk at Shabsosei Tishmoru? The Torah is addressing a violation of Shabbos with a full-fledged malacha milamed tesa malachos, where the father says to the son, I want you to cook for me on Shabbos, shecht an animal for me on Shabbos, where in Binyan Beis HaMikdash we require stacking one stone on top of the other stone and violating meleches boneh. And now we're talking about a case of a lav sheyesh bo kares, because now if you're violating a meleches Shabbos, then it's a kares lav. And that will give me the good news and more good news, meaning we're going to kill two birds with one stone. Number one, you ask me, well, let's derive from Eshabsosei Tishmoru that as a general rule, ein esei docha losas. And we can't answer that Shabbos is different because it's Chumrah de Shabbos. Otherwise, we couldn't apply it to those lavim, lav b'yalm. So we now have a beautiful response to the objection. Hey, buddy, let's derive from this pasuk, Eshabsosei Tishmoru, that ein esei docha losas. You have no justification and you have no kasha here because we're dealing with a meleches Shabbos. And although the Torah is telling me that ein esei docha losas said that Shabbos, we talk about meleches Shabbos, and therefore you cannot override a lav sheyesh bo kares. However, you could override a regular rank and file lav for lav sheyesh bo malchus. Hence, we can once again support the smichas aparshios between kilayim and tzitzis to derive the conclusion that we will override the lav of kilayim for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis by putting on, as we discussed at great length, tcheles, which is a dye that's colored wool, onto a beged shel pishtan, even though what will result is kilayim, but esei docha losas. And now we're even happier because we have even better news. And that is, we can justify the pasuk oleh in the parsha of Yibum with achos ishto. And the reason there was a havamina that Yibum would override the losaseh sheyesh bo kares of achos ishto is because there was a havamina that if one's parent would instruct him to violate Shabbos with a bishul or a shchita malacha sheyesh bo kares, or in the case of the mitzvah of binyan beis hamikdash, to violate Shabbos with meleches binyan, we had a havamin, if not for the posuk Shabsosei Tishmoru, that the essay would override the losas sheyesh bo kares. And if that be the case, then we could justify the havamina and therefore the necessity of the maskana, the drasha of oleh in the case of Yibum with achos ishto. So again, just to summarize, at this point in the Gemara is now satisfied with two answers to two questions. Number one, why not derive from here the opposite conclusion that ein esei docha losas? And number two, what was the havamina that justified the need for the drush of oleh in the case of Yibum b'achos ishto? And the answers to both of these questions is that the pasuk of Eshabsosei Tishmoru is addressing a case of a malacha gemura sheyesh ba kares, and in such a case, the Torah is teaching me that the essay, whether it be kibbud av, whether it be the essay of kibbud av in the case of Tumas Kohanim, in all those cases, the essay cannot override the malach of Shabbos, whether it's maleches soser, maleches bona, and soser as well, and maleches bishul or shchita. And therefore, we're going to derive from this drasha and the need for Eshab Sosei Tishmoru that there was indeed a havamina that a mitzvah could override even a lav sheyesh bo kares, and hence we need a leah in the case of Yibum and Achos Isht. Says the Gemara, we can still push off this proof from Binyan Beis Hamikdash. Ela bishum diikol mifrach malahanoch shekain hechsher mitzvah. Now again, as I mentioned over and over again, the phrase hechsher mitzvah here is being used in a different context and means something different than what we normally think it means. Hechsher mitzvah means that there's no way that you could fulfill the mitzvah without violating the law. And that's a principle of dechiyah. Whenever you see the word dechiyah, for example, let's say dochalosaseh, you always have to add a bamedvar mamurim, a restrictive clause. That essay dochalosas applies because you have no other possible method of achieving your essay without violating the law. That's called, in the Gemara's language, hechsher mitzvah. You cannot build the Beis Hamikdash without putting one stone on top of the other. And you cannot feed your father without cooking the meat. Raw meat just doesn't go. Maybe raw fish, but not raw meat. And if that's what is on the agenda, is on the table, there's no possibility of kibbud av without bishul, without the malacha bishul. However, the Gemara thinks, and again, we have to analyze this thought because it's not necessarily what we would have said intuitively, that the case of Yibum cannot be derived, it cannot be by analogy compared to the cases of kibbud av ha'em, etc., because in the case of Yibum, it's not a hechsher mitzvah. Why? Because the Torah gave the Yavam another option, and that is chalitza. Now, again, you and I might have said intuitively, chalitza is not really another option. Chalitza is a matir that removes the zika and allows the Yavama to marry someone and break up the zikas yibum, just like get breaks up ishus and allows a woman to get married. But the Gemara sees it differently. The Gemara thinks that in terms of the chiyuv that the Torah obligated the Yavam, it's a twofold chiyuv in a sense, not twofold A plus B, but twofold in the sense of A or B. And both of these options would constitute a full-fledged kiyum, a fulfillment of the obligation that is imposed upon the Yavam. So that there's no need, there's no absolute need for the Yavam to have a relationship with his Yavama who's achos ishto, because the Torah says you have another alternative fulfillment of your obligation by giving her chalitza. And with that, Shalom al Yisrael, you have fulfilled your obligation. And therefore, the Gemara is now offering the following bircha. You have no proof from Eshab Sosai Tishmoru that if it wasn't for this pasuk, we would have applied the principle of Esei Dochalos Esei Sheyesh Bo Kares, and therefore plug it into the case of Yavama in Achosi. So no. There's no such justification. because in the case of Yevamot, it's not a hechsher mitzvah. The limiting clause of dechia is hechsher mitzvah. We have it in the cases of kibbud av ha'em with regard to bashel or shchot. We have it in the case of binyan beis hamikdash with regard to meleches boneh. These are cases that can be classified as what? Hechsher mitzvah. There's a head-on collision between the essay and the los essay that doesn't allow for a kosav ashlishi shiachriya beineim. And therefore, since the Yavam has the option of chalitza, we never would have applied the principle of dechia to be doche the lav of achos ishto. Hence, we're back to square one, and we still have no answer to justify oleha in the parsha of Yibum. And now we're up to the Gemara of hechsher mitzvah. So the Gemara raises the following problem. Hechsher mitzvah, tepukle mehasa. Okay. You want to know what the din would be in a case of hechsher mitzvah. Would it be docha losa seshesh bo kares, or would it not be docha losa seshesh bo kares? In a case of hechsher mitzvah, meaning when there's no alternative. So let's suggest the following. And this will be a yalfutza that the Gemara is pressing for. In the case of kibbud av, which does not override the Shabbos, even though it's a hechsher mitzvah, meaning you got to cook in order to present the food to your father. Now, why do I need a drasha to prove that kibbud av ha'em, in the case of, we'll call it basheli, does not override the Shabbos? I don't need that. That drasha is completely redundant. Why? Because I already have the drasha of Eshabsosai Tishmoru teaching me in the case of binyan beis hamikdash that we will not override the Shabbos for the sake of binyan beis hamikdash. Why is it necessary to teach me that I will not override the Shabbos for the sake of kibbud av ha'em if I already know that I will not override the Shabbos for the sake of binyan beis hamikdash? And as I said to Jeff the other day, that I might be putting my head out on the chopping board here, but I think, nobody says this, but I think what the Gemara is operating with is a principle called im'eno inyan. That if the Torah repeats a drasha and teaches me the same halacha, or two different scenarios of the same principle, and I could have derived one from the other, why did the Torah have to repeat itself? It's totally redundant. The answer is going to be im'eno inyan. You might think that we will derive the conclusion from Eshabsosai Tishmoru that ein esei docha losase in the case of losa sheish bo kares, but only because it's hechsher mitzvah. But in case of hechsher mitzvah, no, I'm sorry, I added an extra negative here. Let me start again the last sentence. Scratch it. We want to derive from Eshabsosai Tishmoru that there was a halamina bialma meaning in general, that essay would be docha los sheish bo kares. That was the good news that we had presented and argued to justify oleha in achos ishto yibum. And why? Because in the case of Shabbos, we're dealing with a violation of Melecha Shabbos, and yet the Torah has to teach me that we will not violate Melecha Shabbos because it's a lav sheish bo kares for the sake of an es. But the implication is that there's a very strong push that essay would be docha lo sheish bo kares, and therefore in the case of Yibum we need a leh. So then we rejected it. Why? Because in the case of Shabbos, we're talking about hechsher mitzvah. And in the case of hechsher mitzvah, the Torah is telling me that if not for the pasuk of Eshapsoso Tichmaru, we would be docha a lav sheish bo kares. Yeah, but that's only in the case of hechsher mitzvah. Has no implication as far as Yibum, where the option of Chalitza is a viable option. Says the Gemara, then, according to your logic, why did the Torah need two different Eshapsosai Tichmorus in order to teach me the very same halacha? It's totally redundant. Unless the Torah is telling me that, as a rule, Esei docha lo sheish bo kares, even when it's not a hechsher mitzvah. Because again, if you're telling me that Bi'alma in general, Esei docha lo sheish bo kares, in the case of hechsher mitzvah, why do you tell it to me twice? In both cases, whether it's kibbud av ha'em or whether it's binyan beis hamikdash, it's absolutely necessary. We have no way out to violate the lav sheish bo kares for the sake of the essay. We can't fulfill the essay in any other method. So the Gemara is saying, why would the Torah repeat itself? Now, when I first learned this Gemara, I said to myself, what do you mean, why did the Torah repeat itself? It says, Eshapsosei Tichmoru. So for that, we have to open up a Chumash. I mean, Mitch doesn't have to open up a Chumash, but we have to open up a Chumash. And what we're going to find out is that the Torah says Eshapsosei Tichmoru twice. Again, I didn't believe this, but I saw it inside. Let me just open up to the pasuk. If anybody can tell me, just to save me the... Where is it? Just 1 second. Bays. He'll tell me. Vayikra Yutes. Pasuk Lamed. We'll start with Vayikra Yutes. Pasuk Lamed. I mean, you have to see this inside to believe it. You know, if you don't look inside, it's like, come on, you're pulling the wool over my eyes, right? So it says over here, Eshapsosai Tichmoru, this is Pasuk Lamed in Perek Yutes, Umikdashai Tiro, Ani Hashem. That's number one. Now go back to the beginning of Parshas Kedoshim, Perek Yutes. Ish imo v'aviv tiro, pasuk gimel, eshapsosai tishmoru ani Hashem. Those words, eshapsosai tishmoru ani Hashem, appear twice in the same chapter of the book of Leviticus. Why would the Torah have to repeat it? Once in terms of ish imo v'aviv tiro, and a second time in mikdashay tiro. Twice in the same parak. You know, that might not bother a biblical scholar, but it bothers a ben yeshiva who's trained in the methodology of studying the Torah, because the Torah doesn't repeat itself. And in fact, we have two different brisos. We have one brisa that addresses the case of ish imo v'aviv tiro, to tell you that Eshapsosai Tishmo do not violate the Shabbos for the sake of your parents and their command. And then we have another pasuk in the context of Mikdashai Tiro that we will not violate the Shabbos for the sake of the Beis HaMikdash. Why do we need two psukim? That's where I quote the halacha, not the halacha, but the methodology, the principle of him eno in it. I don't need it for a case of hechsher mitzvah when there is no other way out and it's only possible to fulfill the essay by violating the law. I need it for a case where I can fulfill my mitzvah, have my cake, and eat it too without violating the law. And that's exactly what happens in the case of Yibum. We have now a situation in which, even though it is ein bo hechsher mitzvah, which means I have another option, another way out, I can fulfill my obligation and yet not violate the lav and the erva of achos ishto. And the Torah now is telling me that esei docha los aseh. Again, the exception is going to be Ashabsosei Tishmaru, but the exception sheds a light on the rule. And the rule is that esei docha los aseh, and get this, los aseh afal pisha yesh bo chiv kares, and two, afal pisha eno hechsher mitzvah. And that's why the Torah had to repeat Eshabsosei Tishmaru ani Hashem. Again, when I saw this inside the Chumash, I couldn't believe it. This was just a char b'haskala. I was missing that very important point here, that the Torah tells me that in these cases there's no dechia of Shabbos, but as a general rule, we would say that there's a dechia of Shabbos. Okay, so now let's just figure out where we're up to. We're up to Enochinami, which you'll see about, let's say, 5 lines up before the end of the Omer, 6 lines up. And we're going to take a little bit of a pause here. And I think, again, I don't know who has which pages, but at some point we photocopied page Mem here in the Yalkut Bi'urim. And again, if you don't have it in front of you, it's not a major barrier. Torah Shebal Peh. And we have a kasha, the Rishonim, the Balei HaTosfos, which really is going to occupy our minds. The Gemara on Daf Hey Amud Beis had derived from the Smichas HaParshios between Kilayim and Tzitzis the principle of esei docha losas. The problem is a principle called hutar michlola. I think in the past we've had occasion to discuss this principle, hutar michlola. And that means that if you have 2 lavim and you're comparing them on a scale, one of them is absolute, the other has a heter to it. That's called hutar michlola. And again, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but the classic case was chadash, that the Isur chadash, which encompasses both achilas adam and achilas mizbeach, has a heter michlolo. After the Omer is brought on the 16th of Nisan, we chip away at that Isur chadash, and as far as achilas adam is concerned, the Omer is matir, and the Isur remains as far as mizbeach is concerned. And then we'll wait to Chag HaShavuos to bring the Shtei Alechem, which will complete the matir. But in that period in between, we have what's called hutar michlol. And there are many examples of hutar michlol. A lav that's hutar michlolo, which means that at some point, in some scenario, it becomes permissible, is considered a light lav in comparison to a classic lav, which is lo hutar michlol. I mean, have a balloon. If you puncture even the smallest hole in the balloon, eventually all the air is going to escape from the balloon. So that's a weaker lav called lav shehuta mechlol. And now the Rishonim want to know, how do we classify the Iser Kilayim? Meaning, if Kilayim is a classic, strong, all-encompassing lav, lo huta mechlolo, then I can understand that if an essay like tzitzis could override a lav shelo huta mechlolo, then we have to derive the conclusion from here, essay dochalosis. But if I could lower the status of Kilayim and prove to you that Kilayim is hutar mechlolo, that the lav of Kilayim does not always apply, if I can find even one scenario in which the Torah allows a leniency in Kilayim, hutar mechlolo, then essay dochalosa says hutar mechlolo. That doesn't teach me anything. 99.999% of the lavim are low with the mechlot. So you found one case where the Torah allows you to violate the lav for the sake of a mitzvah. That's only because that lav is that one exception, 1 in a million case of a lav shehuta mechlolo. What makes Kilayim huta mechlolo? So for this, we have to know a little bit more about Big Day Kahuna. And as you know, there are two sets of Big Day Kahuna. There's Big Day Kohen Hedjot and there's Big Day Kohen Gadol. Right? The Kohen Gadol wore 8 begadim and the Kohen Hedjot wore only 4 begadim. Now, amongst the begadim, there was a beged called the avneit, a belt. And there's a whole sugya about whether the avneit, and again, when we talk about the avneit, we're not sure if we're talking about the avneit of a Kohen Hedjot or an avneit of the Kohen Gadol, but whether or not the avneit had kilayim in it. It had both semer upishtan. And now we're going to assume, according to the Rishonim, that in Big Day Kahuna, we're going to find a mixture of wool and linen. Now, it might not apply to a Kohen Hedjot, we're not sure. That's going to be a machlokus in the Gemara, but it definitely applies to the avneit. I'm sorry, let me start again. We're not sure about the avneit of the Kohen Gadol, but as far as the avneit of a Kohen Hedjot is concerned, this is a sugya in Masechet Yevamot daf vav. And let's, again, we have to go through that sugya. It's a complicated sugya, but at least one shall I say, group of Amoraim will argue that in the avneit of the Kohen Hedjot there was kilayim, and even according to the other school of thought that the Kohen Hedjot did not wear kilayim in his daily avodah wearing the avneit, but nevertheless the Kohen Gadol for sure on Yom Kippurim would have kilayim in his avneit. Says Tosfos and other Rishonim, that would classify kilayim as a huta mechlolo lav. Again, as I said before, even if you could find one scenario in which the Torah alleviates the lav, that puts it in a separate category called hutar mechlolo. And the Rishonim say the following. I'll just quote you the language. They say, Heter kilayim b'big day kahuna eino ela mishum esei dochalosas. You want to reject the derivation of Esei Docha Losaseh in the case of Kilayim, because Kilayim is mutter in Big Day Kuna the Avnei, you're making a big mistake, my friend. The only reason why the Kohen is allowed to wear the Avnei is because of Esei Docha Losaseh. It's because he's fulfilling the mitzvah of wearing Big Day Kahuna. So this is not Huta Mechlolo. Huta Mechlolo is meant to undermine a limud, a derivation of a principle. But if the Huta Mechlolo itself is nothing more than another expression and application of that principle, then it doesn't undermine the principle. On the contrary, it strengthens the principle. We have Esei Docha Losaseh in a case if, let's say, I would put tzitzis on a beged pishton, and the tzitzis is made of tzemer. And now we have the case of a Kohen who's going to wear an avnei that has kilayim in it for the sake of the mitzvah of avodas Kohen b'beis hamikdash. Again, an application of the rule of Esei Docha Losas. Al kain eino begeder huta mechlolo. This is not what you call huta mechlolo. Im kol ze, even so, ein lilmod the big day kahuna. Now we have the following question. Well, tell me the truth. If the Kohen is allowed to wear the avnei because of his mitzvah aseh of wearing big day kahuna, why do you have to stretch your arm out to a smichos haparshios between lo silba shatnes and gedilim tasalacha to derive the principle of Esei Docha Losaseh? Why don't you derive it from the avnei? The avnei had kilayim in it, semer pishtan, and yet the Torah, for the sake of the mitzvah of avodas hakohen, overrides the lav of kilayim. Brilliant question. Again, this question is only based on the previous question. As once we've answered the previous question by saying that Big Day Kahuna itself is Esei Docha Losaseh, therefore it's not Huta Mechlolo. Now I'm going to turn around and ask you, so why don't you derive from Big Day Kahuna that Esei Docha Losaseh? And the answer has to be, Mishum shekol mitzvason shel Big Day Kahuna hi b'kilayim. V'dafka b'chai gavna dochim es halav. We will override the lav in a case where we have a mitzvah that doesn't lend itself to anything but a scenario of the lav. You cannot have Big Day Kahuna and a mitzvah Big Day Kahuna without the avnei. The avnei is one of the critical, either 4 or 8 begadim in both cases, without which the Kohen is not wearing Big Day Kahuna. If he's missing one beged, he can't just omit his belt. Maybe for davening, if you daven without a belt, with the Eved Yotze, but not in the case of Big Day Kahuna. And therefore, this is not a source and cannot be a paradigmic case of Esei Docha Losaseh. So when you have a mitzvah, and the mitzvah itself is designed on top of an avera, meaning that's how you fulfill the mitzvah. That's not Esei Docha Losaseh. Esei Docha Losaseh means that you have b'derech mikra, because of the scenario, you have an overriding, or shall we say a collision, in which the essay all of a sudden contradicts the losaseh, or the losaseh contradicts the essay, but not in the case of Big Day Kahuna. Al kain, yitochen shedafka mishum kachem dochen es halav. Okay. Now the question is, what is the nature of this halacha that a Kohen wears kilayim in Big Day Kahuna in the Avnei? Here we have a machlokes, the Rambam and the Rav. And all this is in Hilchas Klei HaMikdash. I think he tells you here, just 1 second, in Mem Daled, Eric Yud Halacha Lamed Beis. Oh, I'm sorry. This machlokes is in Hilchas Kilayim. Okay. Plus of a Rambam. Kohanim shalovshu bigdei kahuna shalo b'shas avoda. Afilu imheim b'migdash lokim al levishas ha'avneit sheyesh bo semer upishte. Lo hutar iser zeh el b'shas avoda she'az hi mitzvus asay kimot tzitzis. So the Rambam has the following analogy. Just like tzitzis overrides kilayim, so you're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis, so too for the fulfillment of the mitzvah of bigdei kahuna, you override the law of kilayim in the avnei. But that's only because of the mitzvah of wearing the begadim. That mitzvah only applies b'shas avoda. In the case of tzitzis, it bothers me not to the least as to what is he occupied with at this point. He always has the mitzvah of tzitzis. That's the greatness of the mitzvah of tzitzis. I never understood why it's a voluntary mitzvah. You know, you could live your whole life without ever wearing tzitzis, and you haven't violated any mitzvah if it's not a negative valid confidence on a deraisa level. Anyway, but that's a different. But in the case of bigdei kahuna, the Rambam says that when are you wearing this avnei? I mean, according to the Rambam, immediately when the Kohen fulfills, let's say he starts with shchita and he ends with zirika, the minute after he zorik it down, he should strip himself of the belt. Take off your belt. I'm not sure about that. Maybe we have to anticipate haktoras, haimurim. The Kohen still has to take the emurim, the chelev, or whatever of the zevach, and he has to burn it on the mizbech. Maybe he's still preoccupied with the mitzvah. What happens after haktoras emurim? He still has to eat the basar in certain cases. Maybe that's also part of shas avoda. I don't know. You have to know how to define the Rambam's b'shas avoda. But clearly, after the avoda is complete, he's got to get rid of his avneit. If he wears his avneit, the Rambam says he gets malchus for levishas kilayim. The Ravid disagrees. And in Hasagas HaRavid, so again, let's just summarize. We said that the Balei Tosfos don't understand how we could derive anything from kilayim b'tzitzis, since kilayim is hutra michlolo, and Tosfos answers no. Kilayim is based hutra michlolo in the case of bigdei kahuna, and Tosfos answers no. Bigdei kahuna is itself a reflection and an application of esei dochalosa. That fits in very well with the Rambam, because the Rambam is saying that bigdei kahuna is like tzitzis, and b'shas avoda is fulfilling the mitzvah of wearing bigdei kahuna. That overrides kilayim in the case of the avnei. However, the Ravid says that akonim mutarim b'levishas bigdei kahuna af shelo b'shas avoda. And this is based on a sugya in Masechet Yevamot. I think it's in the Samachs. Let's see if I'm right. Mem Hey. Samach Tes. Okay, for those who are learning Daf Yomi, we're up to what, Ayin Gimel. So this is just at the beginning of the week, just a Shabbos, when I celebrated my Samach Tes, right? So anyway, the Ravid says that as long as they are in the Migdash, the Kohanim are allowed to wear the Avneit, even Shelo B'Shas Avod. It comes out that according to the Ravid, Kilayim in Bigdei Kahuna is a special heter. It's not the Chia. The Torah is matir, Bigdei Kahuna, even Shelo B'Shas Avoda without esei dochalosas. Is that now we have to go back to our original kash of Huda Mechlolo. According to the Ravid, we don't have the option of Tosfos to say, well, it's not Huda Mechlolo in the case of Bigdei Kahuna, because that itself is esei dochalosa. It can't be according to the Ravid, because Shelo B'Shas Avoda, there's no sync between the essay and the losas, and yet the Torah allows it. So here's a case of a lav de kalayim that doesn't apply to the avneit of the bigdei kahuna. That's called hutar mechlolo. The alkain, according to the Ravid, mutar meim af shelo b'shas avoda, dahavi hutar mechlolo, the lo din b'chiyah. In fact, the Ravid is not alone. Rabbeinu Tam is the dissenting opinion in Tosfos in the Masechet Menachos, and he holds the same thing, that Shalom B'Shas Avoda, the Kohanim are allowed to wear the avneit in the Beis Hamikdash. They don't have to strip themselves of the avneit. Is therefore, how can we derive from Kalayim and Tzitzis that Esei Dochalos Haseh, if after all, at the end of the day, it's Huta Mechlolo B'Bigdei Kahuna? And the Karen Ora, and with this will complete, says, according to the Shitas HaRavid, that the Iser Kalayim is actually an Iser Kal. It's a lightweight Iser because Huta Mechlolo. Achli Idach Iser Gam Esei de Tzitzis Have Iser Kal. Unbelievable. The Karen Ora wants to say that when you put the essay and the losa on two sides of a scale, if you find that the losa goes down a level because it is a lav shehuta mechlolo, take a look at the essay. And if you can demote the essay one level, then you get back to square one. It's like a classic essay dochalosis. In the case of tzitzis, since women are not obligated in the midst of tzitzis, and that makes it into a lav shein shava b'kol, that demotes tzitzis, as we said before, degrades it to a lower level. And even though you've degraded the lotas, and now kilayim tzitzis becomes similar to any essay dochalosas. Sharein noshim mitzubos b'mitzvahs tzitzis me'achar shemetzinu she'essay kal dochalosas kal. Shuv yesh lilmod mizeh l'chol atar kula she'af esei chamur doche los esei chom. Very interesting. The approach of the Karen Ora is not what I call Reb Chaim and his methodology, but it works within a certain mechanical, mathematical system of halacha. That if you have essay dochalosa, when the essay is perfectly healthy and the losa is perfectly healthy, the essay is chamur and the losa is chamur, that's equal to a mirror image of an essay kal versus a lav kal. And that's what we have, according to Karen Ora, in the Ravid Shita and Rabbeinu Tam, with regard to kalayim b'tzitzis. Okay, then, Rabbosai, this is where we're going to stop for today. And once again,